Okay, we're going to continue now with the post-war world. It's easy for me to say. The post-war world, redeveloping, recreating what would be perhaps the ultimate completion of Woodrow Wilson's desire to create a new world order. So there were several things that had to be really evaluated in terms of both the Depression and World War II. The systematic, or rather systemic, reasons for the Depression were very deep. And one of the difficulties that the world had faced was an inability to really determine how much money was worth from one country to the next. So there had been an effort to stabilize currency exchange rates during the Depression that had sort of been deep sixed by FDR. He had wanted to maintain sort of managed currency, inflationary policies, but it was pretty obvious that that had not ultimately prevailed on a global level, causing the Depression to get worse. So what you see emerge really is during the late part of World War II, the nations of the world, major powers of the world that weren't part of the Axis powers at least, including the USSR, was present in New Hampshire throughout the summer of 1944 at a resort called Bretton Woods. And so what was created became known as the Bretton Woods system. There is a link on my YouTube channel for a brief summary of what was created. This ultimate objective was to both stabilize currency rates, but also to prevent sort of the collapse of nations that were indebted as a result of whatever problems, systemic problems. So what you see is the creation of really two institutions that are with us now. You should certainly be familiar with both of them. The first was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or simply called the World Bank. Of course, the United States would be a major lender to this bank, and this bank would then make long-term capital available to countries that were in need of direct aid, so that sort of as a form of a bailout. Now, with the World Bank, the loans themselves were actually carried out through something called the International Monetary Fund. So these two institutions created a system where if countries were in risk of default or collapse, which of course creates conditions probable for the revolutions or for the rise of challenging economic and political ideologies, communism and socialism. So what happened was these two institutions have done a pretty good job in the 20th century. There certainly has its critics amongst liberalization, globalization, in the sense that it puts strings attached to what the loans are. But nonetheless, the Bretton Woods system will survive until 1971, when President Nixon decides to take the United States currency off the gold standard. Our currency had emerged as sort of the currency of exchange, based on its value through hard currency, through hard specie. But since 1971, we've been off the gold standard and really are a fiat currency, and have been ever since. So that's the Bretton Woods system. Perhaps more recognizable and noteworthy is the formation of the United Nations. And so we mentioned the United Nations in Yalta, but Yalta was really not the conference to actually create the United Nations. That conference would be held within days of President Roosevelt dying in early 1945 in San Francisco. So it's important that you recognize that while Yalta, the idea was discussed, it was the San Francisco conference that ultimately created the United Nations. And what was determined there was really historic, really epochal, really, in terms of shaping the post-war world. First of all, it would be headquartered in the United States, which is obviously a great departure from the League of Nations. It would be in New York City. It's on First Avenue on the East River. I have another video accompanying. You could definitely watch where you tour both the Security Council, the General Assembly building. And this body would have the authority to use force, if necessary, to deal with disruptions to peace around the world. And so the body within the United Nations tasked with that responsibility is the United Nations Security Council. And as a product of really the victors of World War II. It's important that you know who, to this day, the permanent members are on the Security Council. There are 5 permanent members. There are 10 members that rotate at large. The 5 members at the time were the United States, Great Britain, France, Nationalist China, which was China under Chiang Kai-shek, and the Soviet Union. Now today, China is still a member of the Security Council, and Russia and its Commonwealth states are the other member of the Security Council, with France, UK, and US still a key part of this. Each of these members would be able to exercise veto power over any resolution involving force or weapons, but it did give the body an authority in which to utilize armed forces, which makes it quite a difference from the League of Nations. There were other key components to the United Nations. The UN is presided over by a Secretary General, and then of course the General Assembly is where the states of the world, the countries of the world, meet and discuss and form agreements. You would also have some success within the early United Nations experience. They were able to promote sort of a peaceful resolution to a conflict in Iran as well as in Kashmir. UN oversaw the creation of the State of Israel. Some would consider that a success, others not necessarily so. But particularly I see the benefit of guiding many colonies to independence, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. And then the UNESCO, FAO, and we're noticing right now, of course, the World Health Organization. All of these organizations within the UN help to promote education and fight hunger and disease. And these are obviously laudable goals. Perhaps most noteworthy for champions of civil liberties and Enlightenment values is the creation of a document named the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This group that created this was co-chaired by former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, one of the most noted activities by a First Lady in history, and really continuing the values that the United States had, as well as now the world proclaiming the ideas of natural rights. Unfortunately, the major failure within the United Nations in its onset is the failure of what's called the Baruch Plan. Bernard Baruch had proposed that we stop, in all honesty, developing nuclear weapons, that if nuclear proliferation occurs, that this will greatly threaten the security of the world, and as it certainly has. President Truman was not particularly interested, though, unfortunately, in giving up sort of the ace-hole card he had at the time. And ultimately, the Soviet Union was also distrustful of it, and so the idea kind of died on the vine. But it certainly would have been it was a laudable goal to try to outlaw nuclear warfare. Another key event following the war was the extraordinary series of trials that took place in the former Nazi headquarters of Nuremberg, Germany. The Nazi leaders who had survived, and I mean the key leaders like Goering and Hess, were under arrest and ultimately would be charged with crimes against humanity. There's a brilliant film called Judgment at Nuremberg, which I encourage you to take a look at. But nonetheless, the key powers went through great effort to make sure that the evidence that was presented in the trials was systematic and effective, and ultimately this would become the first view that many people around the world would have of the ultimately horrifying nature of the Holocaust. Many of the Nazis were convicted. Goering took a cyanide capsule rather than be executed. Several others would be executed, and for most of the world, it appeared that justice had been served, that the Nazis were being held to account for the atrocities, particularly the folks that crafted the Nuremberg laws, that administered the concentration camps, that oversaw the sort of mechanization, the machinery, if you will, of the Holocaust. And by doing that, the message that was hopefully being heard, loud and clear, was that the world would not accept genocide as a crime against humanity, that we would hold you accountable if you, under the auspices of law or under the nation state, carried out such a brutal treatment. So following the Nuremberg trials, when we're in Germany, in many ways Germany was an overwhelmingly occupied country. The Brits, the French, of course we, and the Soviets were all in sort of positions to have military forces and to have government sort of bureaucracy overseeing it. It was very much the objective of the U.S. and the Allies to quickly restore Germany to a strong position vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. Now, the Russians were not at all interested in that. In fact, they were concerned about that. So what happened was each of the western regions of West Germany, which is FRG, the Federated Republic of Germany, each region, which if you look at the slideshow, you'll see how it was divided, ultimately was unified into one nation state that would emerge fairly quickly under capitalism as a very successful democracy. Unfortunately, the Soviet Stalin refused to evacuate or leave East Germany, which becomes known in history as the GDR, and the German Democratic Republic was hardly democratic or republican. But the greater problem was the existence of the city of Berlin entirely within an Eastern German zone. This city would be divided as well, with West Berlin being a democratic safe haven amongst an island of totalitarianism. East Berlin was in many ways ground zero of the Cold War, because refugees and individuals would try to flee from East Berlin into West Berlin. They would flee from East Germany into West Berlin. And so Stalin saw this as sort of a thorn in his side, an overt weakness of his rule over the Iron Curtain. So in discussions, it became pretty clear that the Russians were not going to evacuate East Germany. And in fact, in 1948, the Russians took it one step further. The Soviets made the decision to utterly block all ground access to the city of West Berlin. So we're talking trains, we're talking trucks, were blockaded. And this left the United States and our friends with really very few options. And after considering, using force, which would have certainly provoked potentially World War III, Harry Truman and his advisors came up with the novel idea of simply around the clock flying in supplies to West Berlin, and this becomes known as the Berlin airlift. So repeatedly, planes would fly all day, every day, delivering necessary resources, candy, food, toys, learning supplies, and this went on, and it became very clear to Stalin that the West had both the resolve and the ability to provide for West Berlin as long as it took. And so in the end, in the spring of 1949, he lifts the blockade, he backs off. And in many ways, this is Stalin blinking first in the Cold War, yet we're able to avoid the sort of potential war over this city. Now, because of one individual in particular, America had really begun to recognize that the Soviet Union was going to be an aggressive, expansionary state. And really a lot of that goes to a diplomat named George Kennan. Kennan had worked in the Soviet, he was a diplomat to the Soviet Union, and he worked for the State Department. He releases something called the Long Telegram, which is like thousands of words, basically analyzing the nature, the unique nature of the Soviet Union, of communism under the Soviet Union. And because of that, he believes that the best way to deal with the Soviet Union is not direct confrontation, but rather, like a virus, to contain it. If we prevent the Soviet Union from expanding, by shoring up our allies or limiting its influence in other countries, then we'll sort of hold it in place, and ultimately, hopefully, under the sort of failed concept of communism, it will die a natural death. And ultimately, this proves to be accurate. Kennan understands that the Soviet Union is not going to sit idly by if we practice sort of a modern form of a post-war form of appeasement. So I would definitely note Kennan, the Law and Telegram, and his belief of containment. It's very influential on Harry Truman. President Truman was deeply concerned that the United States would return to its isolationist tradition. It would go back to sort of a return to normalcy, and certainly would not support the military expenditures and the sort of muscular position in the world that he believed we needed to take vis-a-vis the Soviet Union.